Thank you so much for being here today. Now,
Hello.
Karen Drops is an adjunct professor at the Front Range Community College. Karen Drops graduated from Regis College in Weston, Massachusetts with a master's degree in Heritage Studies for a Global Society. She teaches for, the history of Colorado with an emphasis on the culture of Colorado. So definitely check that program out if you know anyone interested. And at this point, thank you, Karen, for being here.
Thank you for having me. Hello from the mountains. I as well am in the mountains today. Hello from Coal Creek Canyon. I said I'm Karen Drops. I'm an adjunct professor at Front Range. And today I'm going to talk to you about Susan B. Anthony and a bit about her journey when she came out here to Colorado in 1877 to promote women's suffrage. Her whistle-stop tour, in quotations, because most of it was actually not done on a train. Trains had not really made their way into the mountains in the area that she was in. And how her trip out here had a lasting effect on how she approached the effects of suffrage, sorry. So first, a little bit about Susan B. Anthony. Susan B. Anthony was born on February 15th in 1820 in Adams, Massachusetts, to Daniel and Lucy. Daniel was a farmer and later a cotton mill owner. And after that, he actually became an insurance salesman. Lucy was from an old Massachusetts family that had fought all the way back to the Revolution, one of the original families. She was raised a Quaker, and he married into the faith. And Susan B. Anthony was a Quaker, which really helped shape her later life, as one of the main beliefs of Quakers is that all are equal before God. And she really remained a Quaker most of her life. Her father was actually thrown out of the faith for allowing children to dance in their house. He had let the local teenagers come and dance in their attic, and this was very highly frowned upon, and he was asked to leave. She started her life in Massachusetts, but later moved to Rochester, New York, where she would go on to become a teacher. And when she was a teacher, she kept writing letters to an Aaron McLean. And one of these letters is actually one of the first times that she mentions the suffrage movement and equality of rights. It's mentioned that these letters between the two of them tended to start arguments. And she writes to him after hearing from Rachel Barker preach. She says, "I guess if you would hear her, you would believe in a woman's preaching. What an absurd notion that women have not the intellectual or moral faculties sufficient for anything but domestic concerns." She kind of pushes this of like, women are allowed to preach. Why are we not allowed to vote? Why don't we have equal rights? And he always would say, well, it's just not the right place for them. So she did teach for some time. She gave up teaching and returned home. And when she returned home, it was during the Civil War, and she meets her two new neighbors who end up being William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass. She befriended these men and they moved her really to join the abolition cause, which was one of her first causes. But she was discouraged to speak in public. A woman was told, "You're not supposed to be speaking," but it did not stop her from giving many passionate speeches for the cause. In 1851, she met her longtime best friend, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and they would spend 50 years together fighting for the rights of women. So one of these first times that she starts to fight for the rights of women is in 1852. She attended the Sons of Temperance conference in New York State, where she went to speak. She got up on stage and started to speak, and she was told to pretty much sit down and keep your mouth shut. You're not supposed to be up there, you're supposed to be here listening. So she leaves that meeting and starts her own group, the Daughters of Temperance, and giving women a voice in the movement. From there, she works with the temperance movement, and then she starts to hear stories about about the inequalities of women's rights, and she decides, I'm going to focus mostly on suffrage. So one of the big movements she does is in 1872. On November 18th, she goes and she votes. She says, you know what, the 14th Amendment was just passed, and it says all citizens have the right to vote. She was promptly arrested. She was brought in a streetcar to the jail, where she was booked and given $50 bail, and she was to go on trial. Before her trial, she went around the country sharing her story and proving that she had the right to vote. The judge was so upset about her telling people what was going on that he moved the trial 2 weeks before to another county. So she spent 2 weeks going to every single town around to talk to them about what her movement was. At her trial, she was denied a jury trial. She was denied the ability to speak in her defense. It has been shown as one of the worst carriages of justice. It's still studied in law school. She was convicted and fined of $100, which she never paid. She made sure to never own any property, because if she did, they could have taken the $100 from her property. And she even had the opportunity to have her sentence thrown out, but she proudly kept it and said, no, not until they let me actually speak for what is going on. But she did get the charges overturned for the men who did help her vote. They arrested a few people. It did lead to one change in law. In 1875, women were seen as citizens, but the right to vote was given to the states. From there, she led the National American Women's Suffrage Association from 1888 to 1900. She traveled the country giving speeches, getting signatures, and lobbying Congress for women. And even till her dying day, about a month before she passed, she was still giving speeches. She was about 80 years old at this time. Her last speech was "Failure is impossible." She gave a few months before death. She passed in 1906, never seeing women to get the right to vote. I'd like to share with you a bit of her obituary. This is from the Statesman, the African-American newspaper out here in Colorado. Said, Susan B. Anthony died last week at 86. Friend of the African Americans, the attending physician was Dr. Marcina S. Ricker, anti-slavery agitator in 1856. She spoke in schools, barns, halls, in churches, or outside. She debated pro-slavery men, delivered 100 lectures a year on women's rights, got women individual rights in marriage, got some states to pass suffrage, but in more education and professional opportunities. She lectured until a few months before her death. Her work would be compared to Carson. It does not seem that this nation might learn that to do justice to all the people, men and women alike, were the only way to secure peace and happiness. But it may take another 100 years. No one can tell, but we will work on and work ever. Said that's from the Statesman. So that's a little bit about her life. Now I want to get into her journey in Colorado. So what's going on in Colorado at the time? This is 1877. We have just become the Centennial State in 1876, where in our Constitution, there was the debate on should women be given the right to vote from the outset. And they said, well, why don't we wait a year and vote on it then? But women did have the right to vote in school elections. So the local ladies wrote to Susan B. Anthony, a few other women, to come out here and talk about suffrage and kind of promote the vote that was going to be happening in October. So on July 6th of 1877, it was announced that talented and distinguished ladies were coming to Colorado to canvass for the bill for women's suffrage. Locals, Mrs. Margaret Campbell, she was going to start in Colorado Springs. Los Animas suggested that they organize a talk or two while these women are out here. And then on September 1st, the Denver News prints that 4 women and 1 husband are to canvass the state. Lucy Stone and her husband were going to canvass with Miss Hinman, Miss Matilda Fletcher, and Susan B. Anthony would be coming out on the 11th. There's a lot of buzz leading up to her talks. Many newspapers announced her talks and felt that her reputation would get a lot of people to come and see her. So On September 10th, she leaves Leavenworth, Kansas. She was staying with her brother. She leaves there at 8:45 in the morning with $600 from her brother, and she heads to Grenada. On her way there, she meets an L.R. Dyer of Fort Ellis, Texas, who donated $10 to the cause. She did all these speeches for free, so she had to look on the kindness of people to let her stay either in their hotels or houses or pay for her food. So it was always nice when someone would donate some money. So on the 11th, she starts in Grenada in the railroad station waiting room, which is a little room. There's usually one for men, one for women, where you would sit and wait for the train to come. The local paper said it was well attended, though in her diary, which I'll be quoting a lot from, her original diaries have been scanned by the Library of Congress. She actually mentions there was only 15 voters there, 10 women, and maybe 20 or 30 boys and girls. She actually writes, it was a poor outlook for the first meeting. They had never heard a lecture, and it seemed to treat the newspaper, and this one lecture can do very little toward lifting the men out of the traditional and educational feelings and prejudices. She's really like, maybe this was not a good idea to come out here. It's a completely different place than the East Coast. The speech that she gave out here, she gave one specific speech. It's called Women Want Bread, Not the Ballot. I have uploaded a reference sheet that will be sent out where you can look at the full speech. And in it, she uses the example of the laborers in England who pushed for the right to vote. And when they achieved it, they had power to make change. That with the vote, there was less need for violence, and they could use the vote to invoke this change. That if women had the vote, they could help change politics for the better by using their voice to help those who do not have one. A quote from this speech is, now that as a result of the agitation for equality of chances and through the invention of machinery, there's come a great revolution in the world of economics, so that wherever a man may go to earn an honest dollar, a woman may go also. There's no escape from the conclusion that she must be clothed with equal power to protect herself, that power is the ballot, the symbol of freedom and equality, without which no citizen is sure keeping even that which he hath, much less of getting that which he hath not. Women are today the peers of men in education, in the arts and sciences, and the industries and professions, and that there is no escape from the conclusion that the next step must be to make them the peers in the men in the government, city, state, and national, to give them an equal voice in the framing, interpreting, and administering the codes and constitutions. Pretty much he says, we're equal in everything else, why can't we vote? Next day, she goes off to Los Alamos, and she's greeted by a large crowd. The newspaper says she reached from the east on Wednesday and greeted by a large crowd. She was able, eloquent, and logical appeal on behalf of the equality for women. Many were won over. Her facts were clean, without gush, true to her topic and the motives of political parties. No thinking person can fail to be highly interested and instructed by listening to Miss Anthony. That evening, she goes to Kit Carson's house. Kit Carson was a kind of exemplary mountain man out here, and she goes and meets with him and his family and has dinner there. The next day, she leaves for Pueblo and was very upset to find that there was no notice of her arriving. No one had actually engaged her to speak. She had even written to the newspaper earlier, the Colorado Daily Chieftain, who put a notice in the paper looking for anyone who would engage her for $30. It seems that no one took on the challenge, but she was able, they did find a place for her to speak. She was introduced by Mr. Hughes, and she describes him as a large lumberman. In her journal, she does love to describe people and kind of give a little randomness to her writing. She says the audience was tough, felt she did not turn one person to the cause. From there, she goes on to Wallensburg, where she visited a friend, Molson, and his wife, Emma. She mentions the beauty of the house that was there. There was cottonwood trees and the children running around, and that Molson was the oldest settler there. She also went to the Father-in-law's Hotel, where she was made comfortable, and met a C.W. Wilson of Austin, Texas, who she said she swayed to the suffrage movement. From there, she went to El Morro, where she stayed at the New State Hotel, which the owner gave her the living room. She writes that she arrived at 7:30 after tedious waiting and a horrible dinner. She does mention the type of food she has throughout all of it, and most of the time it's horrible. She mentions a nightmare she had of her granddad being haggard looking and wretched from drink. She next went to Trinidad. She mentions she finally had great food. She had an excellent cup of tea and coffee and fruit and a good Christian cup of coffee since leaving Kansas. Guessing it's a nice strong cup of coffee. She then moved on to Garland. She notes having another tedious 5-hour wait at the station, but did not go on to have a nice lunch. Did go on to have a nice lunch with a Ms. Lorlas as she rode from through Lakita Pass, which she mentions is bright. It's about 9,000 feet above sea level. She spoke at Mr. George M.C.'s newest hotel in the dining room, had a large audience, but seems to know little about the cause. She mentions a call in Hollingsworth comes over from a local fort. The 18th, she goes off to Del Norte, where she spoke at the Pinkerton Mines. Before her, a colonel, they took the stagecoach out there with Colonel Cleghorn at 6 a.m., and Mr. Lorenzo Dow was also on board, who she notes was a pleasant, intelligent man. She also met a Mr. Healy of Chieftain Motoring, who she calls as shallow and opposed to women's suffrage. She describes the beauty of the mountains and part I really love, and the former inland sea. Anyone who studies dinosaurs knows Colorado used to have an inland sea here. It's like she's also going on with the dinosaurs as well. And she arrives in the town of Del Norte at about 5 p.m. From there, she goes to Lake City. She takes the Rio Grande train and enjoyed a cup of tea and says it was a scary, magnificent night. It was bright and warm, but a little too cold for the heart. So she did go outside for a bit on the train, but did come back in. On the 20th, she spoke at Lake City. The editor of the local newspaper, Henry C. Olney of the Silver World, was there. She got there at about 1 p.m., so after her train ride, it was another 18-hour stage ride. She spoke at the local courthouse. She states there's about 1,000 to 1,500 in attendance. The local paper says there were so many that they spilled out in front of the courthouse. And she spoke while standing on a goods box outside the courthouse. Next day, she was to venture to Ore, but she found it impossible. She says it's 50 miles away from the mountain trails, and with the weather, this being September in Colorado, in the mountains, it could be snowing, it could be icy. You never know what the weather is going to be. It was not possible seeing, as there's no train out there, just a carriage. So she spends a second day in Lake City. She gives another speech, this time in the courthouse again, and she mentions that she answered all objectors. She says, it seems it's rude for me to be here. She seems people want to listen to her speak, but don't actually want to listen to what she's saying. She leaves the next day from Lake City at 6 a.m. and went along the Gunnison Trail for about 21 miles. She goes on to the east to the Indian and Beaver Creeks and spends the night in Sanderson. She tells the story of the landlady she met, who informed her that she did not believe women should have the right to vote. She calls her, in her journal, a silly, weak woman and a wretched cook and a housekeeper. Her husband is for suffrage. She mentions, so let the wretched wife go. She has a bit of sass in her journals. She definitely doesn't hold back. She met a Captain Hayes who will also be voting no. She's like, but he's an Englishman. On the 23rd, she continued her journey at about 7 a.m., went over the mountains and through canyons and came into Sawatch Valley. She dined with Mrs. Ellis, who wants to vote and is wise and clean and a good cook. The husband is going to vote no. She reached Sawatch at about 5 p.m. On the same day, the Colorado Chieftain writes a scathing review of her time in Colorado. One of the main points, and this is part of it, they say one of the main points, the stark arguments of women's suffrage advocates for many years past has been that the extension of suffrage to women would elevate the tone of the politics of the country, purify the ballot box, and bring about a millennium political world that would make the devious ways of politicians straight and clear, the political pool for all its filthy abominations. This is a good string to harp upon. This is a sweet morsel for fools and for enticing bait for those. But unfortunately, like all other political manipulators, the women's rights people forget to practice what they preach. And it goes on to talk about how they keep pushing their own agenda, that they write into every newspaper with only glowing reviews of what's going on, and they're like, in that this is what they said they don't want to have. They mentioned at one point the use of tactics worthy of Boss Tweed. Boss Tweed was a very corrupt politician in New York City a bit before this time, mostly known for Tammany Hall. And they say that it's all about games with them. We presume will tend to elevate the polls as come to our notice in neighboring county. The laws require that the ballots cast at the election shall contain the words women's suffrage approved or not approved, as the case may be. The friends of enfranchising the downtrodden female are having ballots printed containing the words against women's suffrage for the purpose of deceiving the opponents of the movement into voting ballots which would have no effect whatsoever. So they're really trying to be deceivious to get this passed. So after this, the next day she speaks in Saguache with the Honorable Felton, who believes in suffrage, and she speaks at the local courthouse to a packed crowd. The local paper wrote that all were paying attention at the courthouse, though it may have been in vain, as it is the third lecture they have heard on this, and maybe 75 votes will go towards it, but they feel Boulder, Weld, and El Paso counties will go for it. She received a letter from Dr. Avery that she was very upset that she couldn't get out to Ouray. And in her journal, she notes, "I could have done it if the town had known what the geography of the area was." So she left Saguache, riding 48 miles through Poncho Pass. She reached South Arkansas about 6 p.m. She starts writing in her journal about being defeated on this cause. She's like, I'm done. This is just not going the way we want. She stayed with the James Fries, which she notes was a widower, and it was the first time she's ever stayed in a house that she was the only woman and had a man cook for her. Mr. Fries talks about her, at this time she's in southern Colorado, that he's like, maybe you go towards the north, you'll have more success out there. And she takes her advice and leaves the southern counties behind. The next day she goes with Mr. Fries and Mrs. Loretta Sale, and they headed to California Gulch Mine. They went by way of horses and spring buggy. They dined at Browns Creek and spoke in a schoolhouse in Helena. They met a Reverend Mr. Adams, who, unlike most of her friends, said, well, maybe you could stay south. And she's like, no, I'm going north from here. On the 27th, she travels to Granite, Colorado with Mr. Humphrey with his black ponies, she mentions. She stopped at at the Haydens and spoke in their barn to about 30 men. She left there for Oro City, which is now a ghost city outside of Leadville. It was a 23-mile journey. In Oro City, she mentions there's only one Odd Fellows Hall, and she speaks at the local saloon in front of about 70 to 100 voters. And Governor Rout was actually out there in attendance and gave his introduction. From there, she went with Mr. Tabor down to Leadville. Mr. Tabor is a pretty big name here in Colorado. He was a politician and a silver magnate, and he brings her to Leadville, and she speaks at the local saloon, where she mentions was filled with standing men. And in her journal, she notes it was a good speech, but it fell in deaf ears. She seems at this point, again, to be very discouraged in the cause in Colorado, and seeing that it may be in vain. And this does lead to her change in tactic, which I'll get to at the end. That night, she could not find a place to stay, and so she rode 4 miles down the road to a Mother Rayer hotel. On the first, she speaks to an audience in Fairplay. Judge Henry, she says that Judge Henry introduced her, and the next morning at 6 a.m., she leaves Fairplay and rode outside the stagecoach all day, going the 84 miles to Morrison. This is also election day. She continues on to the Grand Hotel in Denver. She mentions she is tired, but enjoyed her ride through the night. On October 2nd, she starts her extended stay in Denver. Over the next month, she visits with friends and colleagues and gives more speeches, not all on suffrage, some on temperance. It's also during this time that she wrote her next speech that she gave on the circuit, titled House is a Single Woman. She spends much of her time with a Miss Hinderman, who becomes her companion. And on October 3rd, several people came to visit her in Denver, a Miss Ball of Kansas, a Mr. Clark, who knew her sister. Her sister had passed away, had come out here, it seems most likely to recover from TB, and she lived out here until her passing. And so that was also part of why she came out here, is to kind of be amongst her where her sister was. She also visits with her cousin, Webster Autry. She goes out to Richard's bookstore and met with Dr. Elida Avery, who offered her guest room, and she accepted. She later had tea and called to Mrs. Abby Richardson. So I did want to mention Dr. Elida Avery was a very accomplished woman whom she stays in her house when she's in Denver. She was the first woman to be admitted to the Denver Medical Society. She was the superintendent of hygiene of Colorado. She was educated at New England Female Medical College in Boston and went on to Brooklyn, but she was unable to set up her practice there. And she was later hired by Vassar College as its resident physician and secretary of the faculty. She moved to Denver in 1874 and left there in 1887 for San Francisco, where she spent the rest of her life as a doctor. And her biggest cause was to get rid of corsets, saying, burn up the corsets, no, nor do you save the whale bones. You'll never need whale bones again. Make a bonfire of the cruel steels that have lorded it over your thorax and abdomens for so many years, and heave a sigh of relief, for your emancipation, I assure you, from this moment has begun. Susan B. Anthony also tried to use clothing as a way to push women's rights. She did wear bloomers for about a year, but felt that it distracted from her message, that people were focusing on that she wasn't dressed the right way. So she stuck with a black dress and an alligator purse. So back onto her journey. On the 4th, she hears from a Mr. and Mrs. Hall, whom wrote her a letter that really moved her. They left her 390 acres of land in Arkansas as a tribute to her life work for women, and they were especially moved by her coming to Colorado to push women's suffrage. That morning, Dr. Avery leaves for the East Coast, and she mentions the house is being delightful and inspirational, giving her the inspiration to write her promise talk, House as a Single Woman. That afternoon, she went to hear a lecture given by Mrs. Abby Sage Richardson on Shakespeare. Here's a bit more of her sass. She writes, "It was good, but such a waste of time and talent to be clugging away about dead men all the time." On October 7th, Mrs. Richardson visits with her, and she mentions again this lady's obsession with old dead men and doesn't seem to take any interest in living things. And she dwells on notable in literary matters of the past and doesn't want new things. So she really judges women who aren't looking towards the future and may have gotten in the back, may have been lost in the past. So on October 9th, she goes to hear Mrs. Margaret Campbell speak on the lessons learned in the defeat of the election. By this time, they had found out that women had lost the right to vote with a 2-to-1 by 2-to-1. She notes it was a fair audience and a fair speech, but not pleasantly spoken. Again, she was very judgmental. On October 10th, she gave a speech at Mentor Hall in Denver to about 100 people. She mentions that she did not feel comfortable in that the greed of the managers who had greed in the managers was a cause of this, because they were really paying a lot of people paid a lot of money to come see her speech, and she was not getting paid to give it. She said she made a tolerable speech, but stiff and strained. On the 11th, she goes off to Boulder, and she gave the lecture, Women Want Bread, Not the Ballot. She mentions being introduced to Mrs. North by Mrs. North and the pastor, Mr. Wright. Many men at the lecture said many strange things and strange arguments. The Colorado Banner writes a review of it, saying she gave a speech last Friday called Woman Wants the Bread, Not Ballot at Union Hall. The title was deceptive. Some were deceived, others no. It was a muddy day. Many wanted to see her as a world-renowned lecturer. Gist of it was that if women had the ballot, they could make their opinions worth something, that they would have a voice in politics, like laborers. Politicians would want to have women on their side. When again, the idea of poor laborers was bread to them. So from there, she spends the next couple of days in Boulder, following around the people, following around kind of in her sister's footsteps. She enjoyed her time there, kind of seeing what Hannah had saw her sister. She returns to Denver, and on the 14th, she spends the day at Dr. Avery's with Dr. Gleason, who she calls attentive, lovely, but a fringe such a daughter want to be such a precious mother. She also mentions Miss Hinderman goes to Colorado Springs with friends and does not talk about getting an amendment pushed forward for suffrage. And she sees that many of the local speakers have lost hope for the cause. She goes to dinner the next night at Margaret Campbell's house. And in her journal, she writes of her that she says Miss Margaret Campbell has a commitment to women's suffrage, and she's really educating people of when begging around among the maggots of the state can't take in the wholesale education of the national American motherhood. On the 18th, she goes to another lecture, Mrs. Richardson, this time on novels of the 17th century, though she notes she got the date wrong. It should have been the 18th century as well, and she should have known better. Again, a little bit of that sass in there. On Sunday, October 21st, she gave a speech on temperance. She was asked by Reverend Ellis to give this talk, but he recused himself the morning of the talk and said that he was away from home. Next day, she heard that he had come at about 9 o'clock that night. She had spoken at about 8 a.m. And she's like, you know what? It didn't really help her cause. She felt kind of taken advantage of at that point. She does mention this was her last day in Colorado. She mentions taking a sunrise walk to see the mountains. One last time is the next day she's off to Nebraska. And on the 23rd of October at 7:30, she leaves for Nebraska. She mentions her biggest regret is leaving the mountains, which her sister spent so much time. So in 2 months of her being in Colorado, she gave many speeches, met many people, and tried to change the minds of men to the cause of suffrage. After her trip, though, she changed her tactics and pushed for a federal amendment or state legislation to get women to vote, saying while she was in the Dakota Territories, there was too much selfishness and ignorance and prejudice to overcome. I just wanted to end with some fun little stories from newspapers and such about Susan B. Anthony as kind of like a popular culture icon. One example is the children's rhyme. I know I remember this one from when I was a kid. It was Miss Lulu had a baby. She called him Tiny Tim. She put him in the bathtub to see if he could swim. He drank up all the water. He ate up all the soap. He tried to swallow the bathtub, but it wouldn't go down his throat. Call for the doctor. Call for the nurse. Call for the lady with the alligator purse. The lady with the alligator, mump says the doctor, measles says the nurse, vote said the lady with the alligator purse. This refers to Miss Anthony. And the alligator purse she would carry around, and that alligator purse is in Rochester, New York, in her house museum. Another one that kind of fun of note was the papers are praising her for paying off an indebtedness of $10,000 incurred by the failure of her paper, The Revolution, some years ago. Her act is deserving all the praise that can be bestowed upon it, and when brought into comparison with the conduct of Christian gentlemen who fail too often with their hands full and never make an effort afterward to pay their old debts, from which they had been relieved in law by the Bankruptcy Act, it is extraordinary and envies an honesty almost superhuman. But Susan B. Anthony is a woman, and women are generally honest in the discharge of their financial obligation. Merchants and other businessmen say that they seldom ever lose anything by trusting women when the woman only is responsible. And last but not least is from the Louisville Ledger. They offer to match Susan B. Anthony against any minister in the land who is spoiling for a fight. Susan is not so vigorous as she was when Titus sacked Jerusalem, but she's sufficiently agile to exercise and any man who has the dyspepsia bad enough to let her try. So that is what I have. Open it up to any questions. I see a couple here. Again, yes, she is buried in Rochester, New York. So why did she start in the southern part of the state? Was the purpose to appeal to minors? It was to appeal to minors. There was about 4 women that came out, and they each took a different section of the state. She was coming from Kansas, so that was the best part for her to go through. Yes, Rebecca, that is a great documentary. You mentioned the PBS experience, One Woman, One Vote. And that's actually where I got the speech, Women Want Bread, Not the Ballot. It's part of that. So part of why Leslie asked, did Anthony say anything about why she thought the referendum in Colorado failed? She really says it came down to the men weren't ready for women to have the right to vote. There's too much to change in their mind. She's like, they have been set in their ways that women are supposed to be at the bottom, and that they're supposed to be subservient, and it's to give them the right to vote. There was a lot of cultural change that needed to happen. So Roxanne asks, can you speak to the reason for wearing white? The best I know is that it's just purity, that if they were given the right to vote, they would have, we're women, we're pure, and things of that. Let's see. So many. So to Rebecca, in a letter to Ellis Meredith, she blamed the Catholic Church and Hispanics. Yes, yes, Rebecca, that is true. And the amendment passed. Yes, one of the ways they kind of pushed the vote again in 1893. One of the ways they did it was that the woman would go to their husband and say, if I vote, that means that's 2 votes against whoever you're against. So kind of let's dilute the vote of the, as they would say, the foreigners. And also a large percentage of the Hispanics had moved out at this time as well. Right. So more about the people she was traveling with while in Colorado. They were mostly women from the suffrage movement, or people she had met while back east. Don't know specifics, but a lot of them were part of the suffrage movement out here. I think she did focus on, Catherine asked, did Susan B. focus on minors because she felt they were engaged in their own labor movement and therefore would accept her logic? I think that was part of the reason why she gave that speech instead of one of her other ones, that it maybe would let them understand where she was coming from, that, it's kind of like the women are striking for the right to vote. And so that's kind of where that one comes from. What happened to the 350 excellent? I do not know what happened. So yeah, it was most likely put into a trust. I don't know what happened to the land. Yeah. And yes, Dr. Avery was president of the local suffrage association. Okay. Am I missing questions? They're coming so quick.
I'm glad there's so many questions for this. It's so interesting to know. While I kind of organize some of these here, beyond Dr. Avery, and you mentioned, I believe, Horace Tabor, did you see any other recognizable Colorado names in her travels?
She meets Rout, Governor Rout at the time. His wife was a huge proponent for suffrage. The picture of them signing suffrage into law, there's her above her. It is a great picture of her like kind of staring him down like, yeah, that's right, I won, I got this. Tabor was there, Ellis. The Ellis family is a large part of Colorado. She meets, it says Mr. Evans, that could be former Governor Evans. But yeah.
Awesome. And then I'm going to go through these questions. So
Thanks.
please be patient, folks. If I miss anything, repeat them in there. But I'm going to start from this one right here. How did you get interested in this topic?
So I started teaching Colorado history about 3 years ago, and the textbook, Colorado, a Centennial State, has like one little line about her coming out here. I know I was looking at things to do for this lecture. I was like, you know what? I'd really like to know like what her time was out here. It's interesting that this like national and international figure came to this little, unknown state. And so once I started delving into it, it's just so interesting. Like I had to shrink it down to 35 minutes, but there's so much more about her being out here and her travels.
For sure. Now, interesting that, it was $30 for her to lecture, but could women attend her lectures in Colorado, and did they?
They did. Women were allowed to come to her lectures. Some of the lectures she also went to were for women only. But there was no restriction of women being at lectures. There were restrictions sometimes of women talking at lectures. But the rules, it seemed like it was a bit more laid back out here, a bit more of the Western idea than the Eastern stuck, specific decorum. That's the word.
I'm curious, did she ever wear any bloomers while she was here?
No, she stopped wearing bloomers in about 1860, around then. She only wore them for about a year, and she was like, no, she said it distracted. She said she got sick of people yelling at her from the street. She's like, no, I'm just going to go with all black from now on. And she wore all black for her whole life from then on.
Wow, I did not know that. And then Roxanne asked, did you say she stayed at Hayden Ranch near Leadville?
So she went through Leadville. She stayed at Mother Meyer's house, which is about 4 miles outside, but she spoke at a little saloon in Leadville. She may have stopped in Hayden and it was just not mentioned.
Awesome. Now, did Elizabeth Cady Stanton help her write the speeches she gave in Colorado?
Yes. Most of her speeches are written with Elizabeth Cady Stanton. That one was written with her.
Yeah. All right. Now, Kathleen asked, who were the primary people who guided her travels and strategy to work for suffrage in Colorado?
So there was a suffrage movement group out here, the Colorado Suffrage Movement, Suffrage Association, and they're the ones that asked them out here. And Dr. Avery was one of the main people who kind of asked her to come out and helped her kind of guide her journeys. So the only place she didn't get to was Ouray. Again, it was September. I don't know why they thought going over a mountain pass in September in Colorado would make it through. So it was set up by the local suffrage movement.
Awesome. Now, do you know, was this the only time that Susan B. Anthony had come to Colorado?
She comes back out in about 1890s on her way to California. She stops for a day and kind of meets with everyone. It was just after suffrage, was passed. here in Colorado, which was 1893. She stops and kind of is like, I never thought this would happen, and then goes off to California from there.
Awesome. All right. Now, did she speak in Morrison? Do you know?
Yes. Yeah. She did speak,
And
I think, in the barn there
in a
very
barn, wow.
quickly.
Okay. And was there any mention of what happened in Morrison?
Not much. She does mention her sister lived in Morrison when she was ill, so she mostly just talks about what she was doing in Morrison, and like her sister and such. It kind of seems like she was going there to pick up her sister's ashes, because it says like Hannah is coming back with me, but never really mentioned beyond that. So
Okay. Now you had mentioned, of course, that she is known for wearing black after the bloomers.
mhm.
Now, Kathy mentions that she recalls her wearing a red shawl. Was that something that she wore?
Yep, she would wear red shawl and such. She's mostly always drawn with the black dress,
Hmm.
um, kind of widow's
Right.
clothing.
From what I have heard about her, she seems to have a very curated image
Yes.
for herself and photos all over the place. So that's very interesting. Do you know if anyone spoke for women's suffrage in El Paso County by chance?
I'd have to look at a map, El Paso, of where El Paso County is, but someone spoke at pretty much every county in Colorado. They tried to hit every single one in the first run of talks.
Okay. Now, Gage asks, the title Ballot Not Bread does seem rather confusing. Is there anything more you can say about that?
So part of it is that it was the rallying cry of the local of the laborers in England, was that they wanted bread, not the ballot. It was also a way to get men to come to the talk of like, oh, this is not going to be about suffrage. And then they get there, like they mentioned in Boulder, like a lot of men were like, what is going on? This is not what I expected. And
Mhm.
that was part of that idea that they are playing tricks on people with the title.
Interesting. Yeah. And then Amber asks, now, does she ever describe what it was like to speak at saloons? I know that saloons were used for much more in this time period than they would have been now, but anything that specific to saloons?
She sometimes mentions like she was there, but no one was really listening, or it was kind of hard to. It was the only place she could speak. She did not like speaking in a saloon. She was kind of also head of the temperance movement, but she knew that's where men would be, so that was the place to speak, and she would just talk and hope someone would listen.
Yeah, all right. And we do find it looks like El Paso County is Colorado Springs.
So
Uh,
Margaret Campbell spoke in Colorado Springs. She started the talk September 1st in Colorado Springs.
awesome. All right, we'll take a few more questions. Lots of talk about Lucy Stone here as well. Um,
Yep, Lucy
did they
Stone
ever?
came out as well.
Awesome. Now we have a question from Roxanne here. Does she write why she didn't come to Colorado Springs with one of the largest populations in the state at the time to speak and advocate?
So it seems like looks like Lucy Stone spoke there as well. So it was kind of like that was Lucy Stone's area, where Susan B. Anthony was going the southern route up over the mountains and back down, where Lucy Stone, I guess she went out because she got Boulder and Denver and Colorado Springs. So it was kind of, they each had their own little jurisdiction areas that they were trying to get.
Okay. Yeah, it sounds like a very planned campaign in
Yeah.
Colorado. Um, Now, there's lots of awesome resources people are sharing about this, local to their communities and primary sources. I urge you all to share those in the chat, and I will put them in a resource email to all who have attended, including that resource document that Karen had given us as well. I'll look for a couple more questions here. Now, Matilda Jocelyn Gage was a suffragist who worked with Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton for a while. Does she mention in any of her diaries about Matilda?
I only looked at 1877. I feel like it may have been mentioned once or twice then. But if you do want to look more, every single one of her journals is up on the Library of Congress, which is in the reference sheet. And you can search by name in it.
Perfect. And then you had mentioned Susan B. Anthony's sister. What did her sister do and why did she come?
So it seems like her sister Hannah was like most people coming out here for what's known as the Colorado Cure for tuberculosis. And she came out here and she did pass before Susan came out here. Her brother was also in Kansas, so the family had sort of moved a bit out west.
All right. Now, looking at all the resources, my colleague Jay did share one of our volunteer historians blog posts on a Susan B. Anthony trip here. So definitely find that. And we'll also share that in the resources. Lots of awesome things going here. Judy says, Anthony wrote the history of women's suffrage with Gage and Stanton. Awesome. All right. Let me see here. Now, do you know anything about, who spoke in Weld County by chance?
I don't know who spoke up in Weld. Not off the top of my head. Again, there was 4 main people who are out here. Lucy Stone came with her husband, Blackwell. Susan B. Anthony had the South. There's Hinderman and one other one. Don't know off the top of my head. And those 4 split up the state. So don't know specifically where the other one spoke.
Perfect. Now keep sharing those resources. A lot of these are on the reference page that we'll share with you as well. Thank you, Sean, for sharing that. Colorado Suffrage Association with the minutes in there as well. So put those in there. We will share them all, as there's a plethora of information that everyone can share, especially respected to the counties that they live in. So thank you so much. Now, one of the questions that came from Abel was, possibly why did Wyoming get suffrage before Colorado? I mean, I could definitely elaborate too, but what would you say?
So the difference between Wyoming and Colorado is Wyoming was done by the legislature, not by popular vote. So therefore, Colorado is the first state by popular vote. Wyoming was also only a territory. If you ever take my Colorado history class, it's on the final. And part of it is that they wanted more people to come out to, part of it was to get more people out to Wyoming. If we give women the right to vote, they'll come out and talk. They'll come out here. That did not work. The other part was, I was just reading an article on it of like, they were trying to get things past the governor and they weren't really very happy with the governor. So they're like, let's kind of push this because he was very right. They were very left and they really helped kind of push it through very quickly. It was kind of one of these, you push this through or you be elected again. Well, not elected, appointed, because there's still a territory at the time. So.
Right. Yeah, it's so interesting. That was 1869, I believe.
Yep.
Now, firstly, I will say that, Amber does mention that we'd love to know a lot more about African-American suffragists. Now, I know a lot about, Elizabeth Piper Ensley. I did a priest here in Denver. Now, do we know if there were any connections with that? I know they were primarily in the 1893 campaign that Elizabeth Piper Ensley was organizing.
I believe, yeah, there were more in the 1893 push. Off the top of my head, I don't know of any, but okay. I do know that we had one of the first African-American women's clubs here in Colorado, and I believe they may have been started around this time as well. So they may have had part to do with that.
Awesome. And then Gage does ask, do you know, were there any Latino or Native Americans in the audience when she spoke?
She does mention Native Americans in the audience in one of her talks. Can't remember which one. I do know she mentions that. There would have been Latinos in the audience in definitely in the southern counties. She does not mention it, but there was a larger population of Latinos in southern Colorado at the time.
Okay. All right. Well, last question here, and then we're going to have an email sent or put in the chat, as well as my email is available as well. If you have any further questions, I am happy to connect us with Karen or resources to have there. But the last question here is, in addition to Anthony's visits to Morrison, do you have any other suffrage-related activities that she would have done in Jefferson County, if you know?
That was the only one from Jefferson County I saw of hers. But then again, I believe Lucy Stone would have been the one speaking out here in like Golden and such. Again, she mostly did the southern part of the state.
Mhm.
I would love to look at like where the other three ladies spoke. I think it was just that's the easiest route back from Leadville to get to Denver is to come through Morrison. She stopped in Fairplay as well.
That's awesome. You know, all of this, it's just so interesting to see the, you know, the number one, the connection nationally to Colorado, especially even well before 1920 with the passing of the 19th Amendment. So it's a really cool thing to see that connection. But also, as you talk about this whistle stop tour and this trek through Colorado, I can just imagine the immense amount of time taken to go on this tour of Colorado. And you're talking about 2 months of traveling in states that Susan B. Anthony might have never been to, as well as many other women that were traveling here. So it's so cool to see some details put into this. Now, there are some primary sources that you have found, newspapers, look into the blog posts. Some of our volunteers have really looked into this as well, and it's just so cool to see those kinds of things there. But now, thank you so much, Karen. We're just going to share what's going on here and then go ahead and give you any time for last words. So give me a moment. Let me share my presentation here. All right. So coming up in 2 weeks, we have our final of this series on August 22nd, and that's going to be with 3 of our historians, many of which have joined these lectures here and there, but Rebecca Hunt, Gail Beaton, and Marcia Goldstein will be presenting More Than Votes, really looking back into the further in history of the suffrage movement in Colorado and in the nation. So 3 of them will be speaking, kind of having a discussion in 3 different parts of that history leading up to 1920. So please do find that. You'll find that as bit.ly / More Than Votes, and that's 2 weeks from now on August 22nd. But this is actually the lead-in for many of our Women's Equality Day week of events. So you're going to find in the chat not only the link to the More Than Votes talk, but there'll be a list of Women's Equality Day events coming with a, starting with this, there's going to be a summit and a number of different things going on. So find that information in the chat. Now, as always, any donations for this do support not only this program, but all education programs here at the Center for Colorado Women's History. Even $5 helps, so thank you so much, and I look forward to what we can arrange for in this series next year. But this fall, we're going to look forward to a number of online items as well. So if you signed up for these Center for Colorado Women's History emails, please do check those in the future. All right, well, Karen, any last words or comments about this or anything else that you'd like to share with the audience?
Just thank you guys for coming out and listening to this. I know it's a little weird doing it from the house instead of, it's weird sitting, giving a lecture. But yeah, thank you guys for having me talk on this. This was so much fun to research, and I'm like looking forward to delve even deeper into it. So yeah.
Awesome. All right, well, thank you so much, everyone. Forward me any questions, and I'm happy to forward that to Karen as well. We'll look forward to the recording on YouTube. It's on History Colorado's page, as well as the Center for Colorado Women's Histories. And thank you for all the thank yous, and we'll see you in a couple weeks. Thank you again.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.